Hello, I'm Esther Gidhu-Ewart. Welcome to Africa 54. Here's what's coming up. The United Nations aid chief says the situation in Sudan is tragic as he appeals for humanitarian aid for suffering civilians. The United States Supreme Court hears oral arguments to determine whether former President Donald Trump is eligible to run for president. And in the Africa Cup of Nations final, host Ivory Coast is set to battle three-time champion Nigeria on Sunday. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. The United Nations aid chief Martin Griffiths says he thinks there's nowhere in the world today as tragic as Sudan. He is urging the international community not to forget civilians suffering amid a 10-month war. David Doyle has more.
Sudan keeps being forgotten by the international community.
The United Nations has urged countries not to forget civilians caught up in Sudan's conflict. A 10-month war there has devastated the country's infrastructure, prompted warnings of famine, and displaced millions of people. But despite this, UN aid chief Martin Griffiths said in Geneva on Wednesday it has been extraordinarily difficult to get attention on the crisis.
Because, of course, we have all these competing crises, Gaza, we were here in this place at Ukraine the other day, and so forth. But I don't think there's anywhere quite so tragic in the world today as Sudan.
The UN is appealing for $4.1 billion to meet the humanitarian needs of those both inside Sudan and those who have fled to neighbouring countries. Griffiths said an appeal last year by the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs was less than half funded. The international community needs to act now, he added, with a sense of heightened urgency.
We must not forget Sudan. That's the simple message that I have to say today.
David Doyle of Reuters with that report. Now for more on the United Nations humanitarian aid and refugee response plans for Sudan, I'm joined live from the UN headquarters in New York by VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bashir. Hello, Margaret. Bring us up to speed on what the UN is doing in Sudan.
Well, as you heard, it's a staggering situation. The numbers are heartbreaking. 27.5 million people are in need in Sudan. Almost 8 million have been forced to flee their homes. 1.5 million have left the country entirely in search of safety. And it's just really impossible for the United Nations to reach everyone. And they're doing the best they can. The UN also says it's the largest internal displacement crisis in the world. And when you think about all the wars that are going on right now, that's really saying something. And it's a very significant crisis for children. 3 million children in Sudan are displaced. And forget about education, they're not going to school. So they're going to lose a whole generation of kids if they don't wrap this up and let people get back to their lives. Another major concern the UN has right now is malnutrition. 18 million people are acutely food insecure. Nearly 5 million are in that emergency phase. And Mr. Griffiths said the other day that if people cannot plant and harvest, if they can't access food at the markets, and now there's also a locust situation going on in Sudan, he said this could potentially spell a famine for Sudan. So the UN is watching that very, very closely. And also on the healthcare front, if you're not eating, you're more susceptible to disease.
Right.
And a large portion of the hospitals and health clinics aren't functioning, and people aren't getting medications for things like high blood pressure and diabetes. And the World Health Organization said that is killing them.
So, Margaret, given all these dire situations facing the people of Sudan, what does the United Nations deem as priority for the Sudanese people?
Peace is priority number one, always. A humanitarian response cannot replace peace. And the UN isn't really a player in the peace process because the US, Saudi Arabia, African Union, IGAD, these are the actors that are doing it. The UN has sort of been shut out of it. As you may recall, their envoy in Sudan was made persona non grata several months ago. So it's really up to these external actors to try and bring the two generals to the negotiating table.
Do we have any donors since the announcement yesterday, very briefly?
Well, it wasn't a donors conference. It was just a launch of the appeal. I believe Mr. Griffiths said that the European Union and Finland had made pledges, but they're expecting to do a donors conference in the near future, I think.
Right, Margaret, thank you very much for your excellent reporting and keeping us up to date on that. Viewers, Margaret Bishia reporting live for us from the United Nations. The United States Supreme Court hears oral arguments Thursday to determine whether former President Donald Trump is ineligible for the office and must be excluded from state ballots because of his role in the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol. White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara brings us this preview.
On January 6, 2021, a mob of Donald Trump supporters who believed his rhetoric that the November 2020 election was stolen stormed the U.S. Capitol to stop lawmakers from certifying Joe Biden's victory. Trump's role in the siege and whether it should make him ineligible to run for re-election is at the heart of the case brought before the Supreme Court Thursday on whether the likely Republican nominee must be excluded from ballots in the state of Colorado because he engaged in an insurrection on January 6.
Donald Trump incited that insurrection.
Mark Graber, a leading expert in constitutional law on insurrections, is one of the many scholars who filed an amicus brief against Trump.
He was told there were people in the crowd with weapons who intended to invade Congress. He responded by saying, when there's fraud, you don't use the usual means. You fight like hell. A reasonable person could say, given Trump's behavior, he intended to inspire an insurrection and participated.
The case is based on the 14th Amendment, written in 1866 after the end of the Civil War, to keep former Confederates, officials from the 11 southern states that seceded from the United States, to protect the institution of slavery from returning to power. Section 3 disqualifies from holding office a person who swore an oath to support the Constitution and then engage in insurrection. Trump says the case is part of Biden's witch hunt against a political opponent, a claim the administration denies. His lawyers argue that January 6 was not an insurrection, that Trump was only exercising his free speech rights. They say Section 3 does not apply to presidents and cannot be used to disqualify Trump. So does Alan Dershowitz, Harvard law professor who defended Trump in the past.
In the absence of congressional action, I don't believe the 14th Amendment is self-enforcing. Otherwise, why would you need Article 5 of the 14th Amendment? It explicitly gives Congress the power to make these decisions.
6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices were appointed by Republican presidents, including 3 by Trump. But despite their ideologies, these justices will contend with the same historical facts presented in another amicus brief by 25 leading historians, including Alan J. Lithman, professor of history at American University.
It's going to be very difficult for them to contradict the historical evidence we present in our brief that Trump is covered, that doesn't require another act of Congress or a conviction, and the section wasn't just meant for ex-Confederates.
However, given the political magnitude of the ruling's impact, the Supreme Court may decline to make a final decision and leave it to Congress. In the coming months, the court will also likely deliberate on Trump's appeal on a separate federal election interference case prosecuted by Special Counsel Jack Smith that was rejected by a federal appeals court Tuesday. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
The Washington-based research group Africa Center for Strategic Studies says Russia's growing influence in Africa is likely to have serious consequences for future governance. Timothy Obiezu reports from Abuja, Nigeria.
This is the first university in Nigeria. Russian language studies was introduced here in 1965 during the era of the Soviet Union. a powerful group of communist republics, including Russia. Then, Russia sponsored many Nigerian students to take the course, including Oluwakayode Omotade, who's now a senior instructor for the language here.
At that point in time, the Soviet Union funded 100% the year abroad program, but due to centrifugal forces and internal dynamics that led to the fall of the Soviet Union, that system of funding was discontinued. In the aftermath of that, our students have had to fund themselves.
Здравствуйте. Сегодня
Precious Akonde was one of them. She was offered a place here in 2017, and 4 years later, she graduated at the top of her class. Now, she's trying to grow a community of local speakers in Nigeria. Though she's worried, people's perception about the language is being blurred by Russia's war in Ukraine.
I was able to introduce it to my family, my mom especially, who always forces me to speak it to her. She doesn't mind saying spasiba, привет, как дела, and пока, that's bye. So, and it just brought joy, it brought a passion, and I became strong, just like the Russians. It's true they say they might be representing war, but they represented dignity, strength. They bring out something in you that you don't know was there.
For years, Russia has been making inroads across Africa, including Nigeria. Russia's partnerships with Africa include education, trade, and investments in military hardware. But Russia's expansion on the continent is raising concerns. The African Center for Strategic Studies says Russia has become especially eager to grow its influence in Africa after it started the war in Ukraine. Joseph Siegel, the author of the report Tracking Russian Interference to Derail Democracy in Africa, says 31 African countries have seen their democracy's course decline over the past 5 years due to the influence of authoritarian actors.
We looked at this across 5 different categories: election interference, the deployment of Wagner forces, undermining the UN, especially on peacekeeping operations, disinformation, and through support of coups and other extra-constitutional actions on Freedom House's global freedom scale of 0 to 100. The countries where Russia has been actively engaged, they score a 19. On Africa, on average, is a 51. And so it has, it's having very dramatic impacts on undermining democratic processes on the continent.
The Russian embassy in Abuja did not immediately respond to VOA's request for comment. Last October, Russian education centers opened in Ivory Coast, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Nigeria to provide students with the opportunity to study Russian and learn more about the country's culture. Political analyst Rotimi Olawale spoke about the situation.
I think that people look at the relationship with Russia and Africa with a narrow lens of just involvement in security and governance. I think that the relationship is far more complex than that. We could see with the impact of the Russian-Ukraine war, it affected the import of grains, especially wheat, into Africa, thereby causing a lot of food insecurity on the continent. So when people single out Russia for such externalities, it makes me chuckle.
Meanwhile, Akonde's focus is to teach more locals how to speak the Russian language and possibly set the record straight. Timothy Obiezu, VOA News, Abuja, Nigeria.
Now for the latest on former President Trump's eligibility or exclusion from running for the top office, let's go live to the Supreme Court, where VOA's reporter Ignatius Anol is standing by. Ignatius, why has the Supreme Court taken this case from the state of Colorado, and what's Trump's defense?
Hi, Esther. It's a momentous case because as we speak, pending, a decision that will be there are several states that are having to the line of Colorado. The rule last year on the 9th that former President Donald Trump was eligible on the primary ballot of that state, essentially because words, his deeds, and in action instigated his to obstruct the of the 2025 Joe Biden. Which
Ignatius, I'm having a lot of trouble with your audio, so we're going to skip it for now and try to reestablish this again in a few minutes. We can move on here to downtown Washington, D.C., where Africa experiences an annual loss of approximately $88 billion due to corruption. As reported by the United Nations, the continent has lost over $1.4 trillion to illicit outflows. The inadequate oversight of public institutions and weak systems significantly impacts public service delivery across the continent. Viewers, Paul Ndiho is attending the James Madison University conference being held here in Washington. Hello, Paul. Tell us what the participants are saying. How are they addressing the rampant corruption on the continent?
Thanks, Esther. First of all, corruption on the continent is a huge problem. It varies in scale. It normally includes maybe embezzlement of funds, public nepotism. But what a lot of people are talking about here is they're talking about how do we combat this corruption? What is it that we can do to fight corruption that is wide? And in some cases, it's unstoppable because people have figured out a way to circumvent the laws put in place by the very countries, and they're still very corrupt.
What are they saying about education? Can it make a difference in fighting this corruption in Africa?
Absolutely. Education is key. Awareness is key. A lot of our scholars here are talking about the simple fact that if they started educating people at a very young age about corruption, it could help. But you also have an issue where the most educated people are using the system, the very system of fighting corruption. You have a lot of highly educated people who have figured out how to beat the system. So how do you address that? I think what a lot of people here agree on is that there are ways to curb corruption. One of the most effective ways that has worked, especially here in the West, is exposing corruption. And how do you expose that? You expose it through educating the masses, through civil society. Take, for example, here in the United States, the civil society is very much a part of fighting corruption. When it comes to Africa, a lot of countries don't have that. They have very weak institutions, they have very weak civil society, so it's very hard to fight corruption. But the one thing that a lot of people agree on is education is key in fighting corruption.
You mentioned education, you mentioned the civil society, but how can the African diaspora help in pushing this role to make sure that the continent is free of corruption?
Great question, Esther. The African diaspora can play a significant role in educating masses back home. You have a lot of people who have come to school here or who are Western educated and who look at corruption differently from the ones that remain there. And the one contribution that they could make to their countries or where they come from is the simple fact that they could help educate the masses in terms of fighting corruption. What is corruption? What causes corruption? Who are the key players? And if they can expose that to the ordinary people, because at the end of the day, the people who suffer as a result of corruption, it's the ordinary people and not the elite. The elite tend to take advantage of the system, but the masses suffer because most of the funds are embezzled by these so-called elite. And so the role of the diaspora could not be more critical if they were to engage with their people back home.
Paul, just curious if the African ambassadors are in attendance here because they play a key role in connecting between the U.S. or other countries they are representing to their own countries in Africa.
Yes, I've seen a couple representatives here who are also trying to learn ways, interact with other people, exchange ideas on how their own countries are combating corruption. You have countries, almost every other country has an anti-corruption desk or an anti-corruption institution that is there to fight corruption. But are they using these institutions really to do the job they're supposed to do? In most cases, some countries have tried. Of course, there's those who have succeeded at fighting corruption, but largely a lot of countries still suffer from that lack of maybe strong institutions, laws in place that fight corruption. And the consequences, once you are indicted of corruption, what happens to you? So a lot of countries are working around that, and that's still a challenge. But hopefully, I think things will eventually work out once all these people figure out that they can fight corruption with the laws that they have in place.
Paul, many thanks for your reporting. Very interesting conference downtown Washington, D.C. Viewers, Paul Ndiho live for us from Washington. Still to come, it's Nigeria versus Ivory Coast in the Africa Cup of Nations final. We'll be right back.
Life's challenges can be viewed as opportunities to grow, learn, and be the best version of yourself. By looking inward, personal development increases your self-awareness, your self-esteem, and your chances to fulfill your aspirations. On this week's edition of Our Voices, we'll be joined by a life coach to explore the journey of personal development and how it can help you cultivate a mindset of success. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
You're watching VOA's Red Carpet. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. Thank you so much for joining us each week right here on Red Carpet. We bring you the latest in
health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linoch Mudu, in Washington, every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
In other news, at least 13 Sudanese migrants died Thursday after their boat capsized off the coast of Tunisia, while 27 others remain missing, according to a spokesman for the court in the coastal city of Monastir. Their spokesman says only 2 out of the 42 migrants who were on board the boat survived after leaving from Jebiniana, a small town near Sfax. The Ethiopian parliament on Thursday approved the appointment of Intelligence Service Chief Temesgen Tirune as Deputy Prime Minister, replacing Demeke Mekonnen. Temesgen coordinated the government's response to the conflict that broke out last year in the Amhara region. And cocoa prices are smashing records almost daily in London and New York as bad weather destroys crops in Ghana and Ivory Coast, leading to a supply crunch. The West African nations are the world's biggest producers of the commodity that is mostly used to make chocolate. Ivory Coast, the host of the Africa Cup of Nations soccer tournament, will battle 3-time champions Nigeria in the AFCON final on Sunday. Africa 54 managing editor Vincent Makori has more.
Ivory Coast have made it to the final of the Africa Cup of Nations despite nearly being eliminated in the group stage. On Wednesday night, fans were celebrating their 1-0 semi-final victory over Democratic Republic of Congo at a fan zone in Abidjan and dreaming of maybe winning their 3rd AFCON title, among them Yaya Kone.
They thought we were dead. When you die and are resurrected, you become even stronger. So the AFCON will be staying in Ivory Coast. The AFCON is ours. The AFCON is for Ivorians.
It's a very different mood from just a fortnight ago after being trounced 4-0 by Equatorial Guinea. The Ivorians only made it through to the last 16 as one of the best third-place teams from the group stage. But against DRC, the Elephants looked in control. Sebastian Heller's 65th minute goal dashing Congolese hopes of reaching their first final in 50 years. Now, the last chapter of the tournament hosts a remarkable redemption story. Will now play out against Nigeria. They beat South Africa on penalties. That's after a dramatic 1-0 draw in which South Africa equalized from the spot in the last minute of the match. The Super Eagles will take on the Elephants for the trophy on Sunday, February 11th in Abidjan. The DRC plays South Africa for third place on Saturday, February 10th.
I'm happy, over happy. If I can't remember the last time I was this happy. Yeah.
Vincent McCory, VOA News.
Nigerians extremely happy. They are in South Africa. Supporters of Bafana and Nigeria Super Eagles were on edge as they watched the game. Tuso Kumalo spoke to some of the fans in Pretoria.
What a spectacular match between South Africa and the Super Eagles of Nigeria. Of course, South Africa putting up its best performance there after a long time. And in the second half, Nigeria coming very hard on South Africa, but we also saw South Africa equalizing them. But at the end of the day, they went into extra time and penalties. And of course, a lot of South Africans hoping that Williams will do his magic there. But Nigerians also showing their skill there in terms of scoring the goals. And by the end of the day, Nigerians taking that semi-final win. And let's see what the fans had to say, both from South Africa and Nigeria, who are gathered here in Pretoria in this club behind me here, watching this game side by side.
I'm on top of the world, bro. You know, man, this is so, I don't know what to say, bro. This is so massive, you know.
Even before tonight, we already know how it is South Africa. When it comes to soccer, no. When it comes to soccer, Nigeria owns the South Africa.
South Africa did the best in this AFCON. It's been a long, like they've been in semi-final. It's been a long, they've been in semi-final now. But now, we show them like, no, this is Nigeria. We play soccer more than them.
I'm hurt. I'm extremely hurt, but I'm proud of Bafana. They gave them the run for their money. Yeah.
It was not our thing. We tried. Our game was not that good. Technically, was not that good.
All roads now lead to the final on Sunday. And whatever happens there, the best team will win. And all fans here saying it is the African football that will emerge victorious. Tuso Kumalo for VOA News in Pretoria.
And thank you for joining us on Africa 54. See you back tomorrow.